Welcome back to the Last Days Book Club. We're reading the book I Will Die Free by Noble Alexander with K. Rizzo. The remarkable story dictated by the young pastor Noble Alexander and his life in a Cuban prison where he was falsely accused in 1962 of plotting to assassinate Fidel Castro. He was determined to fight to stay alive and remain faithful to his Lord inside the very gates of hell. In chapter 1, we read of his arrest on his way home to his young wife and 2-year-old child from the first night of an evangelistic series for the youth of his church. He was stopped 1 block from his home and taken by Cuban G2 officers, the Cuban equivalent of the Russian KGB, to their headquarters. There, he was stripped, shaved, photographed, and imprisoned in a dark cell which had no washbowl or toilet with 6 other inmates. The stench of human excrement was unbearable, and the food was filled with maggots and smelled worse than the human waste in the cell. Little did he know at the time that he would not be freed for another 22 years. We continue the story today in chapter 2 of I Will Die Free, entitled Storm Clouds over Cuba. Cuba, my homeland, is often called the Pearl of the Antilles. When Christopher Columbus landed on Cuban shores, he wrote in his journal that he had found the most beautiful land that human eyes had ever seen. It was a land where the sparkling blue waters of the Caribbean Sea lapped softly against white sandy beaches and coral reefs, where the warm tropical trade winds gently whispered through tall willowy palm trees. It was a land abundant in lush green grass, fruit trees, brilliantly colored flowers, and exotic birds, a tropical paradise. The Greater Antilles, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico are part of the island chain Columbus erroneously called the West Indies. The main island of Cuba is almost the size of all the other islands combined. There are more than 1,600 smaller islands, most with only a few people inhabiting them. One exception is the Isle of Pines, about 90 miles south and east of Havana. As a boy, studying the geography of my country, I never imagined how well I would one day become acquainted with the deadly yet beautiful Isle of Pines. Many have compared Cuba's elongated shape to a hungry alligator, with the capital city of Havana in the north resting on its tail, and Santiago de Cuba in the south in its open jaws. During my growing up years, Fulgencio Batista had ruled Cuba, first through a series of puppet presidents from 1934 to 1944, and then from 1952 to 1958 as the head of government himself. Cuba was regarded as many as the tropical playground of the United States. United States businesses invested heavily in the development of the country. In later years, Batista was rumored to have amassed a large fortune, $300 to $400 million, for himself at the expense of his countrymen's needs, along with rumors of extreme brutality against those who opposed him. His avarice and cruelty paved the way for the young, charismatic revolutionary Fidel Castro and the subsequent rise of communism. This is what the history books will tell you. Native Cubans have a slightly different tale to tell. As a small child, living in the small island community of San German on the southern side of the main island, I was unaware of politics and government strife. My parents, both of pure African descent, emigrated to Cuba in their youth. My father from Trinidad and Tobago, and my mother from Jamaica. There, in the southern province of Cuba, they had met and married. My father, an auto mechanic, trained to become the best lathe man in the community of San German. He owned his own shop, and because of his reputation for exceptional work, he contracted regularly for jobs at the American naval base in Guantanamo. This involved many miles of travel to and from the base. Neither he nor my mother appreciated having him away from the home and his family so often. Certain that his work at the naval base would continue indefinitely, he called a family council and decided that he would sell our home in San German and move south. Once there, he established a new shop in the seaport town of Caimanera. 2 years after our move, my father was working on his lathe when one of the grips broke. The high-speed machine swung free and hit him in the chest. His injuries hospitalized him for 2 weeks. During his hospital stay, he decided it was time for him to teach me the business. After a short recuperation, my father announced his intentions. "Noble," he said, "I won't always be with you. You must learn to run and repair the machines." "After your brush with death," my mother protested, "you want to endanger our son's life?" She argued with my father and lost. I began by learning how to clean and service the machinery. I disliked the work from the start, but in our home, one never defied my father. On Friday, March 19th, 1950, only 2 months after his accident, my father came home after completing some work at the military base. The family spent the evening talking, retiring for the night a little after 10. The next morning, when my mother called my father for breakfast, she found him dead of a heart attack. Since our move, I had spent more time with him. We had become friends, and suddenly he was torn from my life. Shocked and isolated by his death, I mourned my loss. My mother promptly sold the family business. My friends and I attended the local grade school run by the Catholic Church until we reached high school age. That is when I left my friends to attend the Instituto Guantanamo, a school near the American base. I attended the institute for 5 years. During that time, my mother and my sister Paulina, both tired of the constant political upheaval, emigrated to the United States. I chose to stay in my homeland. I felt that as a black man, Cuba offered me a better future than did our neighbors to the north. It was during my years at the Institute that I accepted God's call to the ministry. My future seemed set, secure, predictable. And then came Castro and the revolution. Cuban leaders throughout history have known that revolutions and insurrections always begin in the hilly province of Oriente. Fidel Castro, 7 years my senior, grew up on his father's sugar plantation in the province of Oriente. Coming from a fairly wealthy family, He attended the best Catholic schools in the area. He was a good student and an excellent athlete. Though I did not know him personally, it was rumored that he had had a number of problems by the time he reached the university. In a struggle for power at the university, he supposedly killed his own cousin. During law school, he became deeply involved in radical political groups. He was active in student riots and demonstrations that repeatedly got him into trouble with the police. In 1952, he completed his degree in law and ran for Congress. This was the same year Batista feared he might not win the elections. So rather than risk humiliation and defeat, he staged a revolt and suspended all elections. But this political unrest had little to do with me and my preparation for becoming a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Rumors regarding the growing revolution crisscrossed the island faster than a spring hurricane. In 1953, during a carnival parade, Castro and his men, disguised themselves as Batista's soldiers, entered the Moncada headquarters hospital and killed 18 hospitalized soldiers. Batista was blamed for the deplorable act. 18 months later, after a series of such attacks, the government deported Castro to Mexico, where he built up a mercenary army. In 1957, with monies collected from people in the United States and South America, and with the help of former President Carlos Prio Socarrás, Castro and his men slipped back into Cuba and again committed despicable acts against the people of Cuba, all while disguised as Batista's men. The people, logically, turned against the Batista regime. Many Seventh-day Adventist leaders, while not politically active, believed that Castro would have the power to build a more stable condition for the country. In the Sierra Maestra, sympathetic church leaders became more directly involved, not with the fighting, but with the feeding and guiding the revolutionary soldiers. More and more Cubans joined the movement. In the final days of 1958, it became evident that Batista's days as leader of Cuba were numbered. Rather than face defeat, Batista slipped out of Havana on December 31st and headed for the Dominican Republic. 2 days later, on January 2nd, 1959, rebel troops took over Santiago de Cuba and began a week-long triumphal march northwest to the capital city of Havana. Castro and his men arrived in Havana sporting their rosary beads, a ploy to convince the fervent Catholics that the revolutionaries were indeed loyal to the church. A closer look revealed a different picture. His cornerstone men, like Ernesto Che Guevara from Argentina, Camilo Cienfuegos, a member of the Cuban Communist Party, and Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, who at age 15 had visited the USSR, were staunch communists. After placing these men and others like them in key positions in the Cuban government, Castro began to use plainclothes military men to harass the churches. The Catholics and the Jehovah's Witnesses were the first to feel his iron fist. In Cuba, the Catholic Church commemorated La Virgen de la Caridad, the Virgin of Charity, on September 8 each year. The tradition had begun with the first settlers of our country, but because it was connected with religion and God, Castro refused to allow the people to conduct the accompanying parade. He claimed it would be dangerous, since factions of Batista's men were still at large in the capital city. The priest decided that the people would hold their parade anyway. They would march around the block where the church was located. Castro's plainclothed militia armed themselves with metal pipes, chains, and bats, all innocently wrapped in newspapers. When the people emerged from the church to begin their parade, the fighting broke loose. Hundreds of worshippers were injured or killed. Batista's men were blamed, but the people of Havana knew better. From this event on, Castro removed his mask of innocence. He openly deported priests to Spain and incarcerated his countrymen en masse. The Jehovah's Witnesses' conflict with Castro centered around their refusal to serve in the military and salute the flag. Furious at their defiance, Castro arrested them by the score and confiscated their properties and belongings. Then had them thrown into prisons, mainly the Isle of Pines and Combinado del Este. They were stripped, beaten, and thrown into cells filled with homosexuals. By this time, I had finished my education at the Institute and was working with Pastor Vasquez in the city of Marianao as a youth pastor. I also sold Christian books to supplement my income from the church. We knew from the start that it was only a matter of time till Castro would begin harassing other Christian organizations, including us, the Seventh-day Adventists. Castro's Marxist regime viewed the church as a threat. During the revolution, Castro's people had nicknamed him El Caballo, the horse. So when our pastors preached on the beast of revelation, they were accused and convicted of fomenting political rebellion. Within months of Castro's coup, the governmental leanings towards communism became evident, even to the non-political population of the country. The new leader had promised that his revolution would bring sweeping changes to Cuba, its economy, government, and way of life for its people. And it did. In 1959 and 1960, Castro still had not declared himself to be a communist. Yet the flowery speeches he delivered at public rallies fell crushed beneath the boot of flagrant injustice. Once certain of his power, Castro rounded up his enemies, charged them with committing crimes against the revolution, and conducted speedy mock trials. Some were sentenced to prison, others were publicly executed. Journalists declared that his treatment of his enemies was similar to the way Russia disposed of its dissenters. Like Hitler's youth movement in Nazi Germany and Mao's Red Guard in Communist China, Castro organized a children's group called the Pioneers. Its members possessed unlimited authority. They broke into homes, ate whatever food they desired, ordered citizens to turn out their lights for the evening, and took personal possessions, all confiscated as the people's property. Anyone with a shortwave radio would be accused and found guilty of listening to the enemy's voice. The least infraction, real or imagined, was considered a crime against the state. And crimes against the state never went unpunished. Relations with the United States worsened after Castro nationalized all American-owned oil refineries. The United States placed an embargo on all trade with Cuba, and Castro retaliated by confiscating all U.S. businesses in Cuba. On January 2nd, 1960, Castro charged that all the employees of the U.S. Embassy in Havana were spies. Within 48 hours, all embassy staff members were removed from the country, and the angry US government broke all diplomatic relations with my country. When Castro first came to power, many Cubans escaped from their homeland, including a large number of doctors, lawyers, writers, professors, and engineers. They left rather than have to work for the new government. During that time, I helped many of my personal friends and church members join the Exodus. My mother and sister, now living in Massachusetts, urged me to leave Cuba for the United States while I could still escape. I would have, except for one complication. By now, I had met and married Iraida. She and I had discussed applying for a visa for some time. However, before we could leave the country, my young bride became pregnant. Unfortunately for us, the new government passed a law that did not allow any pregnant woman to leave Cuba. Too late, we realized that we would not be going anywhere, at least not until after the new baby arrived. Maybe later, we consoled ourselves, maybe 6 or 7 months after the birth of our first child. When Castro saw how many professional and educated people had applied for visas to leave the country, he closed the borders. Yet in spite of his best efforts, people continued to slip past border guards and the secret police. And I admit, I assisted my brothers and sisters when and wherever I could. It is difficult to understand how precious were the liberties we Cubans lost. Perhaps no one knows until they're gone. Then came the planned Bay of Pigs, April 15th to 17th, 1961. Cuban counter-revolutionaries, along with the American CIA, planned to invade the island along a remote area of beach called the Bay of Pigs. With the help of air cover promised by the United States military, they would retake the island from Fidel Castro's revolutionary army. In Cuba itself, former Batista supporters and others who opposed the communist takeover of their country prepared for the invasion. Castro and his soldiers, having learned of the planned invasion days before the event, rounded up hundreds of people in the major cities of Havana and Marianao. He locked up 70% of the inhabitants, male and female, in schools, hospitals, stadiums, warehouses, even the zoo, any place they could convert into a prison. At the same time, the regime commandeered the home of Marquez Sterling, one of the earlier presidential candidates killed during the revolution, turned it into the Cuban equivalent of the Russian KGB headquarters and called it G2. The security leak that allowed Castro to prepare for the invasion and the United States government's failure to carry through with the promised air support caused the attempt to fail. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Fidel Castro's paranoia intensified. He had his agents searching for American CIA agents around every street corner and behind every sugarcane plant on the island. The most innocent action on the part of a private citizen came under immediate suspicion. Many of my friends faced his firing squads. Friends like Armando Rodriguez, Perez Lopez, Jesus Cueva, and Enrique Hernandez. Others were taken into custody and simply disappeared, never to be heard of again. Protestant ministers and Catholic priests were particularly suspected to be CIA agents because of the international connections that their positions afforded. Like other Christians throughout Cuba, my wife and I lived in fear. Each time I left home, Iraida and I kissed one another goodbye. knowing we might never see each other again this side of heaven. The first time I held my newborn son in my arms, I wondered if I would live to see him grow up into manhood. Yet, in spite of the hassles, in spite of the raids, and in spite of the killings occurring around us, I believed that I had a job to do. More than ever before, the terrified people of Cuba hungered for the assurances found only in the Word of God. More than ever, they needed the hope for a better tomorrow. The end of chapter 2 of I Will Die Free. Chapter 3 of I Will Die Free, entitled Company in Cell Number 2. The once-a-day arrival of food broke the monotony of prison life. After the first meal of less than fresh meat, our daily diet consisted of a 4-ounce serving of a pale yellow gruel made with cornmeal and water, alongside a slice of rock-hard bread. Fat white worms floating on the surface of the gruel supplied us with protein. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make myself ingest either the gruel or the bread. The other prisoners didn't mind benefiting from my delicate stomach. I sensed they were wondering how long I would hold out before I began eating the putrefied food. As I watched the other prisoners eat, I wondered how long each man had been incarcerated in this hole of death. From the little I could see, some of them had been here for quite some time. What had each one done to deserve such inhumane treatment? Murder? Theft? Black marketing? Member of the underground? I could only imagine the extent of their crimes against the country. I thanked God that once my captors realized my arrest was an error, I would be released and allowed to return to my family. I had no idea how much time had passed when the face of a guard appeared in the little window on the cell door, and he called, "Is Alexander here?" When I answered yes, a bare ceiling light bulb blinked on. I shaded my eyes from the bright light. The food slot in the door opened, and a clump of clothing plopped to the floor at my feet. "Dress and get ready," the guard commanded. "The interrogation officer is calling for you." I picked up a blue and white striped t-shirt and slipped it over my head and slipped into a pair of red overalls. As I adjusted the straps on my shoulders, I glanced down at my garb and chuckled in dismay. Umberto Noble Alexander, a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, wearing such a strange and flamboyant getup. I could only imagine what I looked like. My cellmates laughed in spite of their semi-naked condition. "Don't worry, you'll get used to the zebra look," one of my fellow prisoners said, his voice tinged with sympathy. "We all do." I grimaced and shrugged off his remark. Inside I thought, there's no way I'll be here long enough to get used to any of this. Yet my reason wrestled with a nagging disquiet within me. What if the worst happened? What if I were not released? No, I shook myself in disgust. I would not think such negative thoughts. I had to believe that any mistake the military police might have made would be cleared up quickly and efficiently. I just needed the opportunity to talk with someone in charge, and I'd be on my way home. Steel scraped against steel as the massive door swung open. I stepped out of the cell into the faintly lighted hallway. A wave of fresh air greeted me. My fatigue fell away as I inhaled the refreshing aroma. I could handle anything, I thought, except the foul atmosphere I had just left behind. My military guard, with his grizzled beard and rumpled army fatigues, resembled any one of the hundreds of imitation Fidels roaming the streets of the capital city since Castro's successful coup. The guard slammed the cell door shut behind me and nudged me forward with the barrel of his sidearm. Our footsteps echoed down the long, empty corridor. Along the way, he decided to harass me. "When we get through with you, you won't continue distributing your opium to the people," he said. I thought for a moment, then asked, "Opium?" But I winced as he ground the gun's barrel into my spine. "The opium of the masses," he snickered. "Christianity." As I walked, with the gun pressing against my backbone, I smiled in spite of my pain. Of course, the gospel of Jesus Christ, opium of the masses, according to the Castro regime. Is that the reason I've been arrested? For preaching the gospel? One of his hands grasped my left arm, and his other hand leveled the gun at me as we proceeded through the labyrinth of gray, tomb-like hallways, barred doors, and uneven stone stairwells. As we trudged the length of the corridor, I saw no one, I heard no one. Suddenly, he ordered me to stop, then turned me to face a large metal doorway. In code, my guard escort rapped on the door. The door opened, and the guard shoved me inside a small interrogation room. A wave of cool, refrigerated air hit me, as if I were stepping into a cold storage locker. I would learn later that the room's temperatures could range anywhere from scalding hot to a deep freeze cold, according to the designs of the interrogator and the degree of discomfort to be inflicted upon the prisoner. A man I immediately identified as the officer in charge, in spite of his civilian attire, paced back and forth behind a small metal desk. His scraggly beard imitated the mustache and beard worn by his commander-in-chief, Fidel Castro. With his hands folded behind his back and his chin jutting forward, he strutted like a lightweight bantam rooster anticipating a championship cockfight in the center of Havana. For a moment he stopped pacing and leveled his gaze at me. The cold glint in his eyes contradicted the friendly tilt of his head and the slight smile on his lips. An empty metal chair stood in front of the desk. Without a word, my guard escort and a second soldier who had been standing in the shadows grabbed me and stripped off my clothing. For some time I stood naked, waiting for further instructions, while the three men, each dressed in heavy, warm clothing, laughed and talked among themselves. "The revolution will last forever," my interrogator declared as he seated himself in the chair behind the desk. "Yes," the second soldier agreed, gesturing with his arms. "It is great and invincible." "It will surely last for more than 1,000 years, my guard escort replied. "I do not know if there is an eternity, but if there is, the revolution will outlast it." I trembled from the cold as the three men extolled the virtues and the longevity of Castro's revolution. After a few minutes, as if to purposely allow the cold air to seep into my body, the interrogator ordered me to sit on the empty metal chair. I obeyed. When I sat down, the second officer turned on the light fixture above my head. An 800-watt light bulb, directed straight into my face, blinded me. I blinked, but could not escape the light's intense glare. I closed my eyes, but the intense light penetrated my eyelids, causing intense pain in my eyes. "Father," I prayed silently, "you have promised to be with me. Be with me now. Give me the strength to endure." I took a deep breath and waited. From experience, I know there are 3 things you never do when being questioned by government agents: speak before spoken to, ask questions, or volunteer information of any kind. After a few uncomfortable moments, the officer in charge fired his first question at me. Why were you going to Guantanamo? Guantanamo? I asked. Surprised at his question, I needed time to think. What was he leading up to? Nothing made sense. Whenever I'd been questioned earlier, it was about other people's activities, not mine. Yes, Guantanamo. Then I remembered a trip Iraida and I had made a few weeks earlier. We'd driven down to the Oriente province to see members of my family. I decided he must be referring to that trip. To visit my relatives. My interrogator snorted his disbelief. Though I could see nothing beyond my circle of blinding light, I could hear the sound of a pencil tapping impatiently against the metal desktop. We know that you went to see MacDonald. MacDonald? My voice betrayed my surprise. Sir, I don't know any MacDonald. I sifted through the bits of street gossip and underground hearsay I had picked up at various times. Oh yes, I thought. I had heard rumors about an American doctor at the United States Naval Base in Guantanamo and of his alleged attempts on Castro's life. But I'd never met the man. Dr. MacDonald, the man leaned across the desktop into the light. You know him? The officer's patronizing tone matched the sarcastic smirk on his face. He's a doctor at the hospital on the base. You know that because you went to see him. Apparently pleased with the grenade of information he'd tossed my way, my interrogator folded his arms and leaned back in his chair. These guys are just looking for something to hang me on, I thought. Well, they'll just have to look harder. I straightened my shoulders, elevated my chin, and stared straight ahead into the darkness that engulfed my interrogator's face. In a clear, measured tone, I answered, I repeat, sir, I do not know any doctor by the name of MacDonald. The scrape of metal against the rough concrete reverberated off the bare cement block walls as my tormentor jumped to his feet. I could hear him pace out his anger. Without a word, he rounded the desk. A pair of neatly pressed trousers and highly shined boots came into view. Then his left arm and upper torso, while his face remained outside the circle of light. He leaned against the edge of the desk in an attitude of relaxed composure for a few seconds. Then his body tensed. Umberto, his voice escalated threateningly. Then he pointed a finger into my face within an inch of the tip of my nose. I am being very patient with you, but my patience is growing thin. We know for a fact that Dr. MacDonald was to give you a bomb to plant in Castro's private plane. A bomb? Incredulous, I stared up to where his face would be if I could see it. Where in the world had they come up with that fantastic tale? Don't try to act ignorant with me, Alexander. The man leaped off the edge of the desk as if he leaned against the hot kitchen stove. Tension crackled through the room as he struggled to regain his composure. Yes, a bomb, his voice cracked, revealing his disbelief and frustration. Taking a few seconds to re-establish his arrogant demeanor, he snapped about and strolled back to where I sat. We know, he said, dragging out the no meaningfully. We know you know him. I shook my head and shrugged my shoulders. Well, you all know more than I do. Righteously indignant, he gathered himself up to his full height of 5 feet 5 inches and sniffed. Humph! Of course we do. Get dressed. Sergeant, take him to the room. As I slipped into my clothing, my brain switched into an uneasy neutral, much like an automobile whose engine needs a tune-up. My fingers refused to work, and my teeth chattered partly from the frigid temperature in the room, and partly from the horrid realization that there would be no easy way out for me this time. Dazed, I allowed myself to be led from the room. My guard escort taunted me as we retraced our steps through the serpentine tunnel system. "You'll talk. You wait and see. You'll talk." He took me down one corridor then another. I glanced at the heavy metal doors which broke the monotony of the gray cement block walls and shuddered. Now I realized that imprisoned behind each door were people living in conditions unsuitable for animals, let alone humans. At one corner, when I automatically turned toward the left, my captor redirected me to the right. "This way," he barked, prodding me in the spine with the barrel of his gun. "To cell number 2, your new home." I brightened for a moment. Perhaps conditions would be a little better in cell number 2. My first cell must have just been a holding pen, I decided. That would explain why there were 12 prisoners in a cell designed for 9. My guard stopped in front of the door marked number 2. He flicked on a light switch beside the door and removed a wad of keys from his hip pocket. After unlocking it with one of his keys, he slid the door open. "We'll see if you know MacDonald or not, after spending a few days in here," he said, shoving me into the barren cell. I glanced about for a bed, but there was none. Only a barren concrete floor, crumbling in the dampness of the room. The door clanged shut behind me and the light switched off. Thinking I was alone, I shrugged and sat down on the cold, damp floor. Exhausted, I lay down and closed my eyes, hoping to block out the last 72 hours of my life. Maybe if I sleep for a while, I thought. I curled up into a fetal position, but my hip bone and elbow soon protested. I rolled from side to side, trying to find a comfortable position. I wondered how long they would keep me here, isolated from the other prisoners. How long would I be able to stand the isolation? Before 5 minutes had passed, I learned that my first supposition had been inaccurate. I was not alone in the cell. To the contrary, I could feel tiny feet scurrying across my scalp. I reached up to brush the intruder away, only to discover that my uninvited cellmate hadn't come alone. Out of the nooks and crannies in the walls and broken chinks of concrete swarmed hundreds of bedbugs, cockroaches, and gopher rats. Everywhere I touched, some creature darted out of my reach. I shrank back against the wall and curled my body into as tight a ball as possible, only to hear the deadly hum of mosquitoes circling my newly shaven head. I flailed my arms and legs in a wild frenzy, occasionally connecting with some creature or another. When I felt the warm body of a jungle snake slithering down the side of my neck and onto my chest, I leaped to my feet and threw it across the cell. I glanced about frantically. How many other snakes hung, ready to drop from the ceiling onto my shoulder? Within minutes, I seriously wondered how long it would take before I went insane or got bitten by a rat or a poisonous snake and died. It seemed like a lifetime. But in less than 5 minutes, the ceiling light switched on, and my scurrilous cellmates scattered or slithered back into their hiding places. I stood and brushed the remaining vermin from my underpants. The door to the cell slid open. My grinning guard chuckled at the look of horror that must have been on my face. He waved me into the hall and escorted me back to the interrogation room. This time, the room was warm, and I was seated on a cushion in front of a different interrogator. The officer in charge clicked his fingers. My guard snapped to attention, adjusted the air conditioning dial, then aimed the 800-watt spotlight into my eyes. "Alexander," the new interrogator snarled, "you must understand. I mean business. When was Dr. MacDonald going to give you the bomb?" I whispered a short prayer for strength and took a deep breath. "I know nothing about such a bomb." Do you admit to visiting Guantanamo? Yes. For what purpose? One of my sisters lives on the Cuban side of town. I visited her. The man beyond the circle of light leaned forward. His voice lost the edge of anger he had originally exhibited. Now look, Alexander. We only want to know one thing. How did you plan to sneak the bomb on board the plane? I remained silent, since I knew nothing of the assassination plot he described. His chair scraped against the concrete floor, and for a few minutes I could hear him pace back and forth behind the desk. You do not want to answer because of your contract with the American CIA. We know that you're one of their principal agents here on the island. The voice moved closer until I knew my interrogator stood within inches of me. You did not notice the pillow on which you are seated? He asked. The tone of his voice curled around me like a snake waiting to strike. It is the cushion in which you plan to hide the bomb in order to place it on board the airplane. I looked down at the royal blue cushion beneath me. Blinded by the light, I could not make out any details. The interrogator banged his fist on the table and shouted, "Sergeant, take him out of my presence before I kill him." The guard grabbed my arm and hauled me to my feet. "Maybe a little while longer in the room will loosen your tongue," the officer in charge growled. "Braver men than you have entered that room strong and stalwart and left broken when they survived at all." The metal door slid open, and my guard dragged me into the hallway. I stumbled. He swore and jabbed his gun into my side. I struggled to catch my balance. I felt lightheaded as waves of exhaustion and hunger swirled through my brain. The walk back to cell number 2 seemed endless. Once back inside the cell and with the overhead light blinked off, I stood frozen at the center of the cell, waiting for my cellmates to return. And they did, with a vengeance. Since I had no idea how long I would be incarcerated in the room, I realized I couldn't remain standing. Sooner or later, I would have to sit down. Again, I drew my legs up into a tight ball and leaned against the wall. I swatted at my tormentors, hoping to frighten them enough to snatch a short cat nap. It worked for a few minutes. I awakened to gopher rats gnawing at my toes. An army of cockroaches marched across my stomach, leaving behind an abominable odor. Minutes later, the overhead light came on, and the creatures of darkness retreated. When the cell door slid open, I couldn't decide whether to be grateful for the reprieve or fearful for my immediate future. I was taken back to the interrogation room in order to sit on the same cushion. A different officer, one I'd never seen before, stood in front of me. I could sense the presence of a second officer standing behind me. "Alexander," the new interrogator began, "what were you preaching about in your so-called revival meeting?" "My sermon was about the origin of sin and its consequences," I replied. The interrogating officer pounded the tabletop and snarled. "You said that Fidel was a devil, didn't you?" "You said that, not I. Moreover, I never once mentioned the word devil in my sermon, nor did I mention the word Fidel." I paused. "In fact, if your agent taped the service as I suspect he did, we can go over it together to prove that what I say is true." The first officer straightened and paused for a moment. "Noble, if you cooperate with us, we can make life much bearable for you. You will be rewarded with fruit, rice, beef, if you cooperate." He waited for me to speak. I didn't. "Fine. If you don't want to talk, we'll give you a sheet of paper and pencil. You can write out what you were doing. I mean your counter-revolutionary activities." He handed me a piece of notebook, paper, and pencil. Having nothing else to do, I began drawing Christian crosses. The officer in charge glanced down at my sketches. Furious, he ripped the paper from my hand and crumpled it in his fist. "Give him a phone call," he shouted. For an instant I thought, good, now I can call Iraida to let her know. Then I discovered that my captor was speaking of an entirely different kind of phone call. Simultaneously, two large hands slapped both of my ears with such force that the slap lifted me off the cushion and into the ear. Intense pain shot through my ears. Tears sprang into my eyes. I was certain my eardrums had burst. I felt dizzy from the pain. I will be deaf for the rest of my life, I thought. I didn't realize then how accurate my thoughts were. 23 years later, I still suffer the consequences of their phone call. Above the ringing in my head, I heard my captor shout, "Compañero, take him back." The second officer held a revolver to my head as I struggled to my feet. My guard returned me to cell number 2. For the next 15 days and nights, the pattern continued. First interrogation, then time in cell number 2, and back again for more questioning. Even though I had been denied sleep and food, and was weakened by their repeated beatings, I could never admit to their lies. The longer they questioned me, and the longer they kept me in that filthy cell, the more determined I became that they would not wear me down. I would leave the cell unbroken and unbowed. The end of chapter 3 of I Will Die Free.